Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from being a good start to a great one. This week, we're talking about the mean green jelly bean. Let's go back to when Omnath only had two colors. Omnath Locus of Rage is a 7-mana 5/5 elemental with a landfall ability that creates more 5/5 elementals every time lands enter the battlefield under our control. And whenever an elemental we control dies, including Omnath, we get to deal 3 damage to any target. Omnath is quintessentially red-green. He plays tons of lands, he gets huge creatures, and he even has some enchantments here to deal damage while he does so. It's especially hilarious because most commanders have to pay mana to get 5/5 creatures, but Omnath creates them whenever he gets mana. Alright, let's load up Omnath's average deck list into the Architect deck building website, and remember, any swaps we make must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. This list is probably one of the tightest that we've seen so far on the Upping the Average series. Omnath has been around since the original Return to Zendikar set, Battle for Zendikar, so people have had a lot of time to get to know him really well. So let's see what we can do to just minorly tweak some of the things that we see here to make the deck just a smidge better. We'll tackle this list in the following 3 categories: payoffs, the essentials, and of course, lands. First up, the payoffs. I need to express this right from the start. This is a deck where every card that we play needs to be compared to the utility that it would provide if it was a land in that card slot instead. A land is a 5/5 elemental. A land is 3 damage when that elemental dies. A land is itself a payoff, which means every non-land card we play eats away at the very resources that the deck is built to abuse. So we have to be super extra choosy about them. It's not about diversifying our abilities here. It's about focusing and honing them. I discussed a lot of budget replacements in the Lord Windgrace Upping the Average video. So for this landfall installment, I'm going to go on the more cost neutral route more than the lowering the budget route. And I won't be ripping as many expensive cards right out of the deck. Plus, since that video, cards like Azusa and even Exploration have received reprints, so they're hopefully a little bit more accessible. However, there is still a budget cut I'm gonna make here because, interesting though it may be, I do consider it the lowest priority compared to the other expensive cards in the deck. And that card is Burgeoning. This is a really exciting card, to be clear, and it's kind of insane in wheel decks that constantly refresh their hands all the time, but landfall decks don't really mind having all the land drops happen on their own turn. Actually playing the additional lands is more important, because then you can loop fetch lands from the graveyard with effects like Ramanop, for example. Burgeoning does go excellently with the card Ghost Town, a card I am delighted to see in the average build because it used to be a lot less well known. Like, I think this was my very first Challenge to Stats pick on episode 1 of the EDHREC podcast over 2 years ago, and it was in like less than 10% of the Omnath decks at that time, but I should digress. The point is, Burgeoning's just not super necessary at this price tag for this deck. And in fact, let's take a moment to honor some of the cards we won't be able to add in here because of budget. Morag, for example, is too spendy right now, but oh my goodness, he's delicious. Traverse the Outlands is also insane, but pricey. And Fiery Emancipation is just amazing. This strategy has no shortage of phenomenal cards, but they can't all fit into one deck, and many of them are very expensive. So remember, we're going more on the cost neutral route for the purposes of this video. And remember, you don't quote unquote need any of these expensive cards in your Omnath deck. Check out the Windgrace video for other budget replacement recommendations, but don't sweat it if you don't have the Oracles or the Crucibles or the Parallel Lives. Speaking of Parallel Lives, actually, I'm going to make another cut here. Second Harvest. This card is useful, but only when we're already ahead. If we have 5 tokens, this makes it 10, but if we have 0 tokens, this makes 0. Doubling things has the chance to be a little win more, so we're going to slice this one to make room for more consistency later on. Speaking of which, we need to hone in on the method of victory for Omnath. Omnath has 2 primary win conditions: huge tokens in the red zone, and doming people for damage when those creatures enter or when they die. He's not just about combat. So that right there is actually a pretty diverse set of goals, bolstered by our ability to replay dead lands from the graveyard. So even if we run out of cards in hand, we're still able to make land drops and create tokens at basically all points of the game. This makes me turn a more critical eye towards Multani and Rubble Hulk. I love these cards, like a lot. but for other landfall decks. Here, we're sitting with a wide board of moderately sized beaters, and the rest of our payoffs are built around having that type of board, rather than going in on individually big creatures. We're not struggling in the combat department in a way that these cards would help solve. I'm gonna cut Living Twister for similar-ish reasons. Living Twister helps Omnath against a weakness that's somewhat unique to the landfall strategy, and that's land stalls. I don't mean mana screw, I mean that we've ramped too hard and don't have any further lands to trigger landfall abilities. When we run out of lands to play in hand, we can use the Twister to bounce them to hand and replay them. That shores up the land stall issue. But the thing is, once we've reached the level of tunedness that we're seeing in this average list, with Ramanops and Crucibles and Splendid Rex and all that, well, we're just at much lesser risk of stalling out, because we can still get landfall triggers in other ways. And that makes the Twister's help appreciated, but no longer quite as necessary. Alright, of all the cuts I'm making, this next one is the one I'm probably going to get the most flack about. In a deck this tuned, I think we have to cut Zendikar's Royal. This card is 5 mana to make 2/2s. Those are just not super compelling in combat. What they are is elementals, and that triggers Omnath's damage ability. But that means he needs to be in play for those to register their damage payoff, and that's a minute detail maybe, but the devil is in the details here. And remember, I'm only referring to a deck that has this level of tunedness that we're seeing in the average list. This card really helps Omnath get some extra oomph, even when he's on a budget. But we're tuning up a deck that doesn't have enough room for all the spicy cards that we want to play, so we have to acknowledge that this one has some downsides. It's in a crowded 5 mana slot, and it makes 2/2s that rely upon our commander's presence to reach their full potential, and which don't synergize with other cards in the deck like Elemental Bond and Where Ancients Tread. I like this card, I just don't like it as much as what I know some other landfall cards can do. Landfall isn't a solved archetype, but it's certainly a flourishing one. This isn't a situation where we're scrambling to find playable cards that make the deck strategy work in the first place. No, we're choosing from among 100 5-star applicants when there's only room for like 60. So we gotta nitpick. We gotta really examine them agonizingly closely to try and find those instances where sometimes a card is a 4.9 instead of a 5.0. Because what I want to do is replace some of these with some new Zendikar Rising cards. Ancient Green Warden has already made the cut in the average data, and rightly so, but a lot of other cards from Zendikar Rising didn't quite make the cut, and I think they should, because I like them. A lot. Like a lot. Phylath has gotten flack for only creating tokens based on basic lands, but even if this thing only makes 3 plants, it is still terrifying. And that's point number 1. It is a proper backup to Omnath because it has a different style of tempo. Where Zendikar's Royal makes tokens at the same consistent clip as our commander, this card, Phylath, produces a board state all on its own as soon as it enters the battlefield. And that tempo difference can help us approach different board states more effectively by covering territory that Omnath himself cannot. And point number 2 in its favor is that these little plant buddies are also hilariously sneaky. Let's say you have 2 blockers and I attack you with 3 little plantos. I have an open fetch land in play and a roiling regrowth in my hand. Good luck trying to block, because these lands are now combat tricks. Now, the plants also have the downside of not triggering our other cards like Bond and Where Ancients Tread, but Phylath himself does work with those. Plus, he can grow plants to a really large scale to synergize with other cards we have in the deck, such as Greater Good. Not only that, but Phylath is also an elemental. All around, I like what this card can do just a smidge more than Zendikar's Royal, which is enough to push it out of an extremely crowded field. Then there's Scoot Swarm. Dear Lord Scoot Swarm. This probably looks so silly of me. Like, did this guy seriously cut the elemental making royal enchantment to add in a 3 mana 1/1? Yeah, I did, because the 2/2 elementals don't make copies of themselves. The 6 land requirement on this little bug is nothing. You'll be hitting this trigger literally every time, and the power that these things can amass is the very definition of exponential. Then there's the new Valakut Exploration. Splendid Wreck 10 lands into play and dome the table for 10 at end of turn, or just use it to find even more land drops? Yes, get it in here immediately. Inject it directly into Omnath's veins. Does he have veins? He doesn't have it. Inject it directly into his mana pathways. Anyway, this is a direct damage effect that doesn't require us to go into the red zone to achieve victory. If it ever turns out that we do get stuck in the combat department, this card is a diversification of our possible win conditions that does help shore up a weak spot. And since I'm here talking about cards with landfall abilities, play Stoneseed or Hierophant, people. It's Lotus Cobra 2.0. This card is incredible. Play it. I promise you'll be glad you did. Okay, let's move to part 2. The essentials. So you know how there are those deck building templates out there that tell you your deck ought to contain X ramp effects and Y draw spells and Z lands? Yeah, don't use those here. I personally think of deck building templates in the same way as training wheels, for instance. A very useful tool when you are beginning with a new task to help you feel comfortable and find your proper footing to something that might be kind of daunting and unknown. But as soon as it does begin to feel more comfortable, it's something that you should distance yourself from as soon as you can, because continuing to rely on them does nothing but hinder your ability to continue to develop your skills. And landfall decks are a really big example of why this is the case. They are one among, frankly, many archetypes that simply do not and should not conform to a traditional deck building template, because attempting to meet some quota in XYZ categories would just detract from what the deck is actually trying to do. Remember, this is a deck where every land we draw is also a threat. For us, the line between resource and win condition is a blurry one at best. So all this preamble is my way of saying that in this section, I'm hoping to take a critical look at those must-have categories and even some staple type cards, and basically demonstrate why we don't need to conform to them. First, some rampy things. We have no shortage of good ramp spells here, so I don't feel too bad about cutting the worst of the bunch. Explosive Vegetation has all but been replaced by Migration's Path. Bye veggies, you had a good run. I also don't like Fertilid. I know it's an elemental, and I know it can wait to activate its ability until Omnath is in play, but 5 total mana to find 1 land, even when paid over installments, is just pretty weak. Let's not think of this card in terms of its relationship to Omnath and the effects that it can produce there. Let's think of this card in relationship to any other card that we could be playing in this slot, because I promise there are better ones. Finally, Sword of the Animist, or as my buddy Mudsta calls it, Sword of the Anime. Neat ramp, but we're in green. This is not something that we need an artifact to help us with. That still leaves us with over 16 ramp cards that help increase the number of lands we have in play, not including cards like Scapeshift, Crop Rotation, or even Splendid Reclamation, and also not including the cards that give us additional land drops, such as Azusa and Friends. This is not an archetype that wants to stick to 8 to 10 ramp spells like a lot of the templates will tell you. Here, we celebrate the extremity. I'll just make one swap in the removal category. I don't like Hull Breach as much as I like Chaos Warp. It's just a bit more versatile, even if it doesn't hit 2 targets. Sometimes there's a problem creature that we need gone, and it's nice to get around indestructibility. Removal in this deck is really scarce. There's just this, a Decimate, I think a Beast Within, and what, a Blasphemous Act? Yeah, that's pretty low, but the thing is, for us, that's actually okay. This is a deck where I'm not too worried about adding an extra removal because it's frequently the primary aggressor at the table. This deck gets the commander out quick, and every single card we draw after that point, including and especially lands, causes a really big problem for everyone else. Too much removal would just be a speed bump for us. This is the deck that asks the question, and if other players don't have answers, Omnath makes short work of them. I'm also less worried about adding in some protective staple type cards such as Heroic Intervention. We don't need that as badly as other decks because Omnath recovers crazy easily. He collects the very resource that we need to play him again. Paying 11 to cast Omnath for the 3rd time? I mean, it's not ideal, but it's also not really an issue either. In short, everything is expendable for us, so we don't need to hold on to it too dearly. In fact, I'll make a swap in this area. I know Green Warden is an elemental, but I prefer Balaged Recovery here, by a lot, I think. It can also give us a 5-power elemental because it can be played as a land, or it can be used to get back a card that we need from our graveyard that will also probably actually be able to cast in that same turn because this one doesn't cost 6 mana. Now, draw spells we cannot get enough of, because we want to find more lands that we can play. This is a beautiful symbiotic relationship. Drawing more cards means finding more lands, and playing more lands means we can make more creatures, and having more creatures will help draw us more cards. So, Return of the Wild Speaker is just the most delicious thing. It draws, it pumps, it does whatever we need. I was originally kind of mixed about the card Nahiri's Lithoforming too, but I'm excited to make room for it here. Played in conjunction with the Ramanap ability, this is a lot of extra land drops, and it doesn't even need to be cast for all that much mana. I'm still unsure if this is a solid card for every landfall deck, but it's a happy one here. Finally, my personal favorite spice, Kavu Lair. This card is less than $1, and it is a very big surprise. It functions a lot like the card Elemental Bond in Garruk's Uprising, though with the admitted downside of being symmetrical. That sounds bad, but here's the thing. Who else is going to play as many 5/5s as us? No one, that's who, because their lands don't make 5/5s like ours do. Our final section will be brief. The lands. I made some harsh cuts earlier in the video specifically for this moment. Consider this your intervention. You, yes you need to play more lands. The average deck started with 39 lands, which probably sounds like a lot, but it's not quite. Not for this strategy. 39 just isn't enough. The correct number is probably closer to like 43 or 44. I don't know. That's a debate for another time. I'm not going to shoot the moon here, but I gotta draw a line in the sand somewhere. So here it is. If you're playing a landfall deck, don't let yourself go below 40. A landfall deck's biggest enemy is sometimes itself, because it will run out of lands to fetch and stall out its own strategy. And that is way more likely to happen if we've stuffed the deck full of too many non-land cards. We don't need to get fancy with a bunch of great landfall abilities. They're all amazing, but they don't all fit, and they're all drinking from the same well. So if we add too many of them, none of them is going to get enough sustenance. That's why we honed in on the deck's win conditions so much, because we need to make sure that those win conditions have enough fuel to operate at maximum capacity, which means we need more lands. And that means that we have to be willing to make really tough cuts to make room for them. So I made room for 2 more basics, plain and simple. Heck, if you make an Omnath deck out of nearly nothing but basics, you'll probably do really well that way. Non-basics are really cool, especially because they can provide you with awesome effects without taking up spell slots in your deck. And that is really true, but it's more true for other archetypes than it is for us here in the landfall archetype, where basics actually have a lot of added utility. Ramp spells help us with color fixing, but they also help us with land drops, and having more basic lands in the deck means that we will get to keep those ramp spells active for way longer throughout a game. So make sure that you prioritize basic lands. I can't tell you the exact balance of non-basics to basics that you'll be most comfortable with, so mix and match them as you like, but I am gonna finish up with 2 pretty succinct non-basic land swaps here. Temple and Temple. What I'd rather have instead of these are 2 much more versatile lands. Ghost Quarter can rid the world of problematic lands on the other side of the table, or even be used on ourselves to get repeated landfall triggers. How is this card not already in the average deck? I don't understand. It's awesome. Then there's Kessig Wolfrun. One of the things you can rest assured about in landfall decks is that they tend to have a lot of mana lying around. It's easy to forget sometimes, but landfall can benefit not just from the act of playing lands, but also from the mana that they produce too. And there we have it, our landfall paradise. The link can be found below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed this time with Omnath, and if you have any other landfall recommendations that you'd like to make for your fellow brewers, make sure you leave those in the comments below. Now, I don't know about you, but I think I'm in the mood for some jelly beans. Thanks for watching.